Hello everyone. I should say good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Welcome to this webinar launching the Mapping Africa's Green Mineral Partnership. I'm Amandine Yanguenon, and I'm the head of the Geopolitics and Geoeconomics program at APRI. A very special thank you to our speakers for accepting our invitation, the APRI team for supporting the organization of the event, Vincent, Stephen, Jody, Emmanuel, as well as my co-author, Pia, Lily, Jody, Rajnish, and everyone who made this mapping possible, Michaela, Stephen, Adrian, and Carla. Let me begin with a few words about why we decided to embark on this journey in June of last year. So as you know, nations around are racing to secure deposits of critical minerals driven by the accelerating transition to green energy and the intensifying competition over these finite resources. Critical minerals are essential for manufacturing batteries, renewable energy technologies, and advanced electronics, making them the cornerstone of future economic and energy security. This race is further fueled by geopolitical considerations, as countries seek to reduce reliance on single suppliers and ensure resilient supply chains in the face of rising global tensions. The strategic importance of these minerals has transformed them into key leverage points in international relations, reshaping the dynamics of the power in the 21st century. As you can see with the two graphs, the energy transition will lead to previously unseen levels of demand for certain green, or what we also call critical minerals. At the same time, Africa stands at the epicenter of the global energy transition, holding the key to a greener, more sustainable future. With 30% of the world's critical mineral reserve, most of these resources are essential for technologies like electric vehicles, wind turbines, and solar panels. The continent is indispensable in the race to decarbonize. This growing demand for Africa's cobalt, lithium, platinum, and other critical minerals has ignited fierce geopolitical competition as nations and industries vie for access to the raw minerals that will shape the 21st century. Africa's minerals wealth is not just a resource, it's a strategic asset, placing the continent at the forefront of global effort to combat climate change and power as a new energy area. Against this backdrop, bilateral agreements can be ranged from strategic partnership to cooperation agreements. This agreement with African states have proliferated. The aim of this partnership are to secure mineral access, promote joint ventures, and integrate mineral value chains. There is clearly a major shift taking place in how Africa's minerals are being negotiated, valued, assessed, and used. We realize that it is paramount to obtain a better understanding of these agreements in order to assess their implication for African states and communities. Despite their importance, these agreements are often opaque, with limited public accessibility to allow for comparative analysis. So, at APRI, over the course of the 7 months, our geopolitics team conducted an extensive online search using multiple search engines and databases. So the momentous effort is now contained in a report and depicted in an interactive online map, which we are excited to make available to you today. So let me show you how the map works. So our primary requirement was to have a map that is easy to use with accessible information at first glance. This is why right now from the home page, you can access the overview of the map of Africa. You can immediately see the countries that have signed the most agreements thanks to the color palettes. Look at, for instance, South Africa. By hovering your mouse over a country, you can view detail for each country, including the partner country and the year the agreement was signed. On the second part of the mapping, the bilateral overview, you can see that we dedicate a specific dimension to provide a more detailed breakdown of agreements signed by non-African actors country by country. You can see, for instance, for the EU, on the right, the name of the agreement, the exact signing date, where is it public or not, the source used, and the main areas of cooperation covered by the agreement. The team effort was to create specific category to define the areas covered, as not all agreements are use the same terminology. This potentially opened the door to a possible classification of agreement and comparison between countries based on the areas of cooperation covered. The map, and this is the first aspect, also allows for the visualization of strategic region for certain country and links them to the other cooperation agreement in those areas, such as military cooperation, for instance. And in the final section, the team has begun compiling multilateral agreements, reminding us that states engage not only bilaterally, but also participate in broader initiatives at the multilateral dimension. This section mainly serves as a database from which users can access a brief description of each agreement, a link to the source, and also the participating country. I will stop there, but feel free to explore the mapping and share your feedback. So maybe more about the methodology now. To create the report and the interactive map, we conducted a thorough online search focusing on G20 and BRICS Plus countries, as well as over significant mining nations like Chile and Venezuela. Our goal was to identify and analyze key bilateral agreements in Africa's mineral sectors. This effort resulted in a database of nearly 100 agreements, which we use to create both an interactive map and this report. As an example, the report delved deeper into 12 specific partnerships, exploring their content, scope, and implication. The database includes agreement sources from government publication and newspapers, news reports, offering a comprehensive perspective. Obviously, this is not exhaustive, but it provides valuable insights into partnerships with prominent players like China, Russia, or Saudi Arabia, as well as lesser discussed actors like India, Indonesia, and Turkey. It is worth reiterating that natural resources deals are inherently opaque, and governments often avoid publishing or even mentioning them after approval. National newspaper agencies, which offer the best hope of finding information, have different publication frequencies and capacity to cover events in a country. Thus, countries with less active national news agency may be underrepresented. Some newspapers' articles become inaccessible after a period, as evidenced by broken links to partnership agreements that research organizations cited. Similarly, the accuracy of the content of the agreement when retrieved from newspaper articles depends on the newspaper's capacity to report correctly and comprehensively. Objective is to update this resource over time and to support stakeholders in navigating the evolving dynamics of Africa minerals partnerships. Just one word about the structure of the reports. It's an in-depth analysis of 12 prominent global actors who have such partnership with African states. You can see the US, the UK, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Russia, India, China, South Korea, Japan, Indonesia, and the EU. Each country and the EU section you will see include key findings, an overview of the national mineral strategy and geopolitical ambitions, examination of relationships and agreement with African states, and a discussion on additional measures beyond bilateral agreements. Although the report and the map are organized around non-African states, I think that's really important to mention today. that African agency is shaping also this agreement. As an Africa Focus and Africa Forward Research Institute, we recognize that African states have actively and strategically navigated the changing geopolitical landscape, achieving varying degrees of success in asserting their priority and interest. So this is now time to say thank you. And just to let you know, the data we've gathered offer a wealth of opportunity for analysis and deeper insights, many of which are already explored in the report. Or whether the main purpose of today is to invite our guests and each experts in their own fields to share their unique perspectives and uncover additional insights that these reports help bring to light. So without further ado, I will hand over to Chris. Thank you.
Amandine, thank you very much, and good afternoon, and welcome everybody from me. Amandine set out the report, but a couple of ground rules before I continue. This to remind everybody that this webinar is being recorded, and after we've had our presentations, I do encourage you all to post questions in the question facility. And we will be monitoring those throughout the conversation. If you do want to be able to ask a very specific question of clarity, for clarification, or a specific point about someone's presentation, just flag, for this person, I want to ask this. And we will pick some of those up as we hear the presentations. Otherwise, we will curate all of your questions during the Q&A at the end, and we do hope to be able to cover everything that you are trying to raise. For speed and efficiency, the bios of the speakers will be shared with you also, so you'll be able to click on those and you should be able to see the bios. So I won't be reading them out, but I'll briefly introduce everybody. Before I do, just to reiterate, I think some of the points that Amandine has said. This report, it stands out that at the beginning of the report, it notes that between 2019 and 2023, 43 national critical mineral strategies were created across the globe. And as a result, we have 70 bilateral and multilateral partnerships in Africa. And there's really useful details within the report about that. Now, these are, as been noted, clearly driven by some of the supply chain concerns in an age of geopolitical tension, not just from China, but also what does a changing administration in the USA mean for global supply chains. And as someone who has been following this and some of the geopolitical element of it, I'm confident that this is the first report, or this is the first piece that I have seen that really presents a holistic analysis of all of those partnerships and tries to map out from an African perspective what it's trying to do. So it really does fill a gap, and an important one in that respect. As I said, I think that this is the first that I've seen. And it also covers these partnerships from an African perspective, and how do African countries themselves triangulate some of these partnerships. And how do they seek to engage? It's been mentioned that case studies then produce additional emphasis on this, and I think really demonstrate this connection between accountability, transparency, the role of parliaments and the media, democratic institutions, and means by which that we can support participation as a means for better outcomes. So the report is really strong on for delivering that. And I think it's going to be really useful for analysts, for governments, for companies, for international organizations, all seeking to understand, how do these things fit together, and how do African governments and civil society and citizens and communities navigate these partnerships and try and make sure that they are delivering for ordinary people. As has been noted, the report is being launched in parallel to the online map, which I do encourage you all to go and use. But it is also a complement to wider initiatives and publications by APRI in this space. So I do encourage you to go and not only read this report and play around with the map and have a look at the interactive tools, but do read some of the other reports and papers that have come out of this as well. That's it from me, waffling on, telling you why I think that this is really important and interesting. I'd much rather listen to the experts that we've got gathered here this afternoon and hear about why they think it's really important and interesting, because they have much more to talk about than I do. So I'm really happy to be welcoming to this this conversation three really esteemed speakers. We've got William Davis, who's an economic advisor for the Intergovernmental Forum on Mining, Minerals, Metals and Sustainable Development. Some of you may know him from his previous role at UNECA. We have Dr. James Cust, who is the chief economist at Future Green and a visiting fellow at the University of Oxford. And again, some of you may know Jim from his previous role at the World Bank. And we have Dr. Veda Vanjanathan, who is an associate fellow on foreign policy and security studies at the Center for Social and Economic Progress in New Delhi. So really delighted to have you all here. William, we're going to start with you first. And I think that there's three real issues that we want to hear from you about. And one of them is the extent to which these agreements support African countries' ambitions to add value to their own resource deposits. What does global competition mean for accessing these deposits, and also what does that global competition mean for African utilization of those deposits? And how, in your view, does the mapping of these agreements really help us to improve our understanding of how these partnerships can support those ambitions? So, Will, over to you. Thank you very much for joining us.
There may be an echo on my sound. So
you're coming across lovely and clear. We can see your presentation.
Okay, that's fantastic. Well, first, let me say apologies for the delay, everyone. And it's an honor to speak with you today about Africa's green mineral partnerships. I'm going to focus this afternoon in line with the questions that Chris just posed on how these partnerships can better serve the African continent, in particular through supporting its aspirations to add value to its green minerals.
So, sorry, William, we can't see your presentation on YouTube.
Oh, okay. Let me, yeah, I'm not sure.
Oh man, it's all fine.
Can you see, but you can see it on the Zoom call, is that right? Just 1 second. How's that? Can you see it on YouTube now?
No, not yet.
Okay. I'm not sure how to address this.
C'est
I
bon?
used the link.
Yeah, you can share it now.
Okay. Uh, it's already sharing, so I'll stop sharing and then share again.
Yes, it worked. You can go ahead.
Okay, that's perfect. Thank you very much. So the key messages of my presentation today are as follows. First, to my knowledge, the details of many of these agreements remain sparse, and there's also little concrete action contained within most of them. To change this, Africa and its partners can draw lessons from the more concrete partnership agreements that do exist. In particular, by seeking to involve institutions with the means to fund concrete action when it comes to designing and implementing these partnerships. Second, although several of these agreements commit to support Africa to add value to its green minerals, it remains unclear how they will do so. Africa's partners should follow through on commitments to support value addition on the continent, and where such downstream value addition would be economically viable. Where it is not, they should provide other benefits to African countries in lieu of these promises if they're not going to be kept. And finally, these agreements are part of a broader context of a scramble by many countries to secure supply of critical minerals, not just to accomplish their own energy transitions, but also to boost their domestic downstream industries that are based on those minerals. This race to win the energy transition risks distorting the global economy at the expense of lower income countries, and also potentially at the expense of the climate. As a result, a multilateral cooperative approach to energy transition value chains is preferable to the current disorganized state of affairs. So now moving on from the key messages into the details. As I mentioned just now, we can see from the agreements covered in this data set and from broader trends that rich countries and some large emerging markets, particularly China, are trying to secure the critical minerals that they need for the energy transition and for certain other strategic technologies. This includes many minerals that are produced in Africa. Yet many of the agreements that we see in the data set provide few details on how the different partners will accomplish the lofty aspirations and expressions of political principles that are contained within them. In some cases, there are commitments to dialogue or to promote networking between private firms, but that's about as concrete as they get. But a few green mineral partnerships, mostly outside of the continent, but with perhaps the notable exception of the Lobito corridor within Africa, are more concrete and could have a positive impact. And so I'm going to talk about those to see what lessons we can draw from them. A few that I've noted include obviously the Lobito corridor, but also partnerships between Australia and the US, between Chile and Japan, and between the EU and Kazakhstan. All of these examples involve financial support from either high-income country governments, development financing agencies, from their state-owned enterprises, or from multilateral development banks. China is also providing such support to build infrastructure, for example, around critical minerals, but not, as far as I can see, in the context of these partnership agreements, rather state-to-state agreements. Instead, it's often using possibly state-allied companies. For example, Chinese mining and mineral processing companies are investing heavily in critical mineral producing countries such as Chile and Zambia, including making extensive investments outside of mining. In the case of Chile, for example, there was an agreement between a Chinese company and the government for discounted access to Chile's lithium in return for investment in downstream value addition in the country's lithium sector. In the China-Zambia case, the Chinese company in question announced plans to invest $13 billion in the country 1 week after the Zambian president undertook a state visit to China. This both kind of the trends that we see in Western countries' partnerships and those of China raise the question of whether, to make these deals concrete, governments need to turn to entities that can raise private finance, such as their development finance agencies or companies, so that they can put their money where their mouths are for these deals at a time when public budgets are extremely strapped. The exception to this broader trend seems to be Australia, which has been able to put public funding for its partnership with the US and another with India. But then Australia is in a better position, fiscally speaking, than other high-income countries. Now I'm going to turn to a different issue. Many African countries aspire to add more value in country to their minerals, whether this is through mineral processing or manufacturing mineral-based products. This kind of resource-based industrialization has been successful in some countries, but failed in others, where downstream industries have been uncompetitive. Africa does already possess quite a lot of green minerals. Or does already process quite a lot of its green minerals. For example, most of the continent's copper and nickel are refined in Africa. And many African countries produce manufactured products based on these minerals, such as copper wiring and even electric vehicle batteries or battery cathodes in some cases. This graphic shows the potential to increase exports of value-added products that African countries already export, according to analysis by the NGO Publish What You Pay. That analysis suggests that Africa does have significant opportunities to add more value to its energy transition minerals, but in specific parts of the value chain and by pursuing the right policies. So instead of a blanket approach of we must process all minerals in country and develop resource-based value chains, African countries could be selective. This is because perhaps governments cannot do everything and will need to prioritize. African countries can therefore assess which... Sorry, that's my son who's speaking, who's decided to come up. I'll try to keep going. We must process, instead of a blanket approach of we must process all minerals in country and develop resource-based value chains, African countries could be selective. This is perhaps because governments cannot do everything and will need to prioritize. African countries can therefore assess specific value chain segments, which specific value chain segments it is in their interest to develop. What role can these partnerships agreements play in supporting value addition in green mineral producing countries? Well, they could provide technical and financial support and investment in downstream industries in producing countries. And indeed, some of these agreements already do that. In addition, where the agreements commit to building infrastructure, they can ensure that it supports value addition by serving locations where mineral processing or manufacturing could take place, and not just providing transport connections or energy for links between the mine and the port, while bypassing potential locations for industrial clusters. Yet, such efforts to encourage value addition in green mineral producing countries may prove fruitless if the ongoing global race to win the energy transition continues. In particular, many rich countries, as I mentioned, and some upper middle income ones, are using policies to distort green mineral value chains so that mineral processing and manufacturing takes place in their territories. This makes it harder for poorer countries to add value to their green minerals. This could undermine the global economy at the particular expense of lower income countries. I know that it could be argued that these policies accelerate the energy transition in some of the world's most polluting countries, such as the US and China, and that therefore they're good for the climate. But the specific approach taken by these policies is undesirable. In particular, they allow richer countries to monopolize green mineral value chains when these countries could instead focus on promoting the purchase of renewable energy technologies and funding research that would support industrial development across the world, but would allow these technologies to still be manufactured where it is most efficient for this to occur. But by instead trying to win the global energy transition, it's going to be both inefficient and bad for the global distribution of income. And in fact, these policies could even be bad for the climate. This is because some of the countries that are pursuing this approach most aggressively use dirtier energy to power their industries than do many major critical mineral producers, particularly in Africa, where most countries rely largely on hydropower for energy. So by trying to monopolize critical mineral value chains, the rich countries in China actually risk increasing emissions along those value chains. What's more, preventing mining countries from getting maximum benefits from their mineral resources could reduce the production of these minerals, given that the perceived economic benefits of mining are a key factor determining the social license to operate for mining. This is a key concern of mining companies, that they have this social license. And thus reducing the supply of these green minerals would then slow down the transition to renewable energy. So what can Africa do about this? One approach would be to pursue multilateral negotiations on policies around these value chains to support the aspirations of mineral producers and capture more value from green mineral value chains. Another thing the continent can do is to leverage the demand for its minerals to secure concessions from downstream buyers, as Chile's partly state-owned enterprise SQM has successfully done with its lithium reserves. However, African countries need to be careful not to overplay their hands. The continent's share of mineral exploration declined from 2012 to 2021, although it has now stabilized, which suggests that the continent is struggling to attract a mineral investment. This is not to say that African countries should be as investor-friendly as possible, but it's about achieving the right balance between maximizing the benefits from each investment to the host country and encouraging new investment. Zambia is an interesting case, as the country has managed to mobilize a lot of new investment in mining in the last few years, and other sectors of the economy that are linked to it. Apparently, the key factor in the success being the use of economic diplomacy rather than heavy-handed approaches. To conclude, I'm going to put the key messages that I outlined at the beginning back on screen. I would also like to really welcome this publication of the mapping and suggest that it can be used to make cross-cutting observations and recommendations about how these partnership agreements can do better. It can also be used to identify identify best practices drawn from some of the better examples of these agreements. I think as we move forward, it would be important to update it with information on new partnerships that emerge, but also to try to track track trends in countries that are signing up to these agreements, so that we can measure their effectiveness and what drives success or failure of these different agreements. Thank you very much. That's all from me, and looking forward to the discussion.
Oh, William, thank you very much, and thank you very much for the contribution of Davis Jr. there as well.
So sorry about that.
No, absolutely fine. It's lovely. Look, I think 4 key points, I think, for people to reflect on there a little bit. One is efforts to win the global transition are going to be counterproductive, and competing over access to geological deposits and then competing on processing, both Europe and Africa trying to have processing within their own borders, is going to be counterproductive. I think that there's a point there that if African economies and African states don't benefit from resource extraction, it's going to be really hard for companies to extract in those jurisdictions. I think there's an important point around partnerships and including financing within those partnerships, including from DFIs, Exim banks, and others, and targeting that financing towards ecosystems where you've got mines, processors, refineries, smelters, fabrication, and industrial usages, so that it's going to places where these things are all in the same place and having that efficiency, particularly given where partners who are trying to leverage private sector investment will be going up against people who are putting state-driven investment into this. And where the money is coming from certain states, they clearly have higher risk premiums and are happy to put large sums of money towards certain activities, but without supporting beneficiation and resource utilization in other areas. And I think finally an important point there on why African states need to reflect also on why money flows to the places that it does, and for a real reflection on what can be done to ensure that the partnerships that are there are these better partnerships that we're given in some of those examples, where they do include those financial commitments as well. So what can African states themselves do to make sure that they benefit from these better partnerships? And that brings us on to Dr. James Cust, who, as I said, Chief Economist at Future Green, visiting fellow at the University of Oxford, and previously with the World Bank. And some of these questions really lead into the presentation that we're going to hear now, which is around how do states and agreements, particularly in the context of critical minerals, impact this industrialization journey. What can countries do to realize value addition and spur sustainable development? And I think a really important point that has been raised already, which is about cross-border cooperation and regional cooperation on industrialization efforts, particularly to achieve ambitions like the African mining vision. So, Jim, it's a great pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon, and we very much look forward to hearing what you've got to say. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chris. Yes, and thanks for the invitation to join you all today. It's great to be here, and really happy to see this work done. I want to start by just acknowledging how important and timely this is. So it's a fast-moving space with these agreements, and as the team discovered, it's not easy to track down this information. There's a lot of opacity. Bringing it all into one place is a really valuable step. It's going to be useful to researchers, but also to policymakers. And part of the challenge going forwards is really making sure that the maximum value comes out of these agreements and new ones that are being negotiated and signed as we speak. And so this is going to be a really valuable resource. I encourage everybody here to check out the website and the report. And it's an important step in transparency as well. So as William mentioned, there's been previous efforts to get financing agreements available to the public. Similarly, with mining contracts, there's been efforts in the past to get mining contracts published so they can be compared across countries and see what commitments companies are making. I think there's a similar challenge here of let's see what's in these agreements, because to get from the agreement to actually operationalizing it, there's big questions in terms of who's going to do what on what kind of timeline, and whether we'll really see this becoming concrete, as Will mentioned. So I think some things that struck me from the report is first the variety of countries involved. So this is great news for Africa. Reflects the new global dynamics and interest in Africa's critical mineral endowment. So there's a big opportunity here. Also, the scope of these agreements, the ambition in these agreements is very promising. But of course, there is still a gap between what's been announced, what's been agreed, and the actual implementation, operationalization on the ground, whether the capital flows will really emerge to support this ambition. In terms of what this means for African countries' industrialization journey and what role these agreements can play, my comments really focus on four different areas. So The first is around the partners that African countries are going to need on this industrialization journey. The second is around the capital and capabilities they're going to require to get there. The third is around other investments beyond the mining sector, so around things like transport and energy. And then the fourth point that Chris mentioned is the questions around regional integration. How does this relate to things like the African mining vision, the continental free trade area, and the RECs, the regional economic communities as well? Because many of these agreements are bilateral, they're not regional in nature. So let me take each of these in turn. So I think the first one on partnerships. So the world is increasingly uncertain and increasingly multipolar, and so having the market access and collaboration with these international partners around Africa's mineral endowment is going to be really important in the years to come. And these can be a foundation for dialogue and for further commitments in terms of this kind of cooperation. So in that sense, this is a very promising development over the last few years. The big question, though, is around whether this can be accompanied by the scale of capital and capability acquisition that many African countries are going to need to not just get the minerals out of the ground, but to actually realize their ambition around value addition and breaking into global value chains. And so it can't be done alone. It can't be done with the fiscal revenues generated by mining alone. And it cannot be done without upgrading technology. And so this is where it's not just the international partners who are going to be important, but it's going to be the companies that they can mobilize to follow. And often in many low-income countries, mining companies are the most close to the technological frontier of all the firms operating in these countries. And so the question is whether this can move along the value chain towards manufacturing. And this is a big challenge for many countries. Around the transport and energy, these agreements could be very important in terms of mobilizing additional sources of capital beyond the mining sector. And so, of course, to realize these downstream ambitions, you're going to need a lot more investment in the transportation infrastructure, in the energy infrastructure, in these kind of enabling environment investments. And so this is where these agreements could play a very pivotal role because governments are going to have to be heavily involved there. But the fourth area is perhaps the more challenging one, which is around regional integration and how this contrasts with some of the regional cooperation that's been happening in Africa and frankly is likely to be necessary to realize the ambitions that many of these countries have in terms of downstream value addition. So to put this in concrete terms, we can think about the size of the markets, the size of these economies, the size of these mineral endowments is often quite small and may be shared across borders. So the geology crosses borders, but also the transportation needs crosses borders, the energy needs crosses borders, and so on. And so there's a really important role for regional partnerships, regional collaboration that many of these bilateral agreements do not acknowledge and do not explicitly incorporate. And so there is a question going forwards around whether this is going to help or hinder the path to industrialization, because pooling of capabilities, pooling of comparative advantage, pooling of endowment may be very important for some of these countries to realize their ambition. And so how do we go from bilateral to multilateral, incorporating regional institutions, whether it's the African Union, whether it's the RECs, whether it's the continental free trade area and the African mining vision, as Chris mentioned. So these are all big open questions. And I think one cautionary note I would sound is that if you look at something like the ambition of the continental free trade area of removing and reducing tariff barriers, of linking economies much more closely to enable this kind of pooling of capabilities and picking up different bits of the supply chain depending on national capabilities. We've seen a lot of legislation in the past that has been much more national in character. So one example of this is local content legislation that we've seen enacted all over the continent, but invariably expresses the ambition of local content in purely national terms. In fact, it's quite limiting in national terms. It doesn't allow for neighbors to participate, for other members of the RECs to participate in these kinds of agreements. And so you could argue this runs very counter to the sort of spirit and goals of the Continental Free Trade Area, and the challenge of creating real comparative advantage in these downstream industries. And so, again, this is a risk that we might see not just in the local content legislation, but again, with this kind of bilateral approach, that countries might be missing an opportunity to pool capabilities and pool opportunities and actually have a collaborative approach within their neighborhood that may be necessary to realize the full potential here. I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Kim, thank you very much for that intervention and for raising some of those points, particularly around the need for regional integration, around developing some of these priorities and some of these deposits, and for pointing out, the flip side of that highly nationalized legislative environment, particularly around things like local content, is also partly defensiveness, where there are going to be winners and losers in this. And some of the mining events that many of us have been attending recently, you see mining ministers from very small countries with very small deposits telling the world how wonderful they could be and how they desperately need mineral processing. And there are going to be some countries that just aren't going to be there. So that's something for consideration, and also pointing out the need for partnerships for both capital and capability acquisition. Just having a resource deposit doesn't mean that there's the ability to move further up the value chain alone. And I think important point to make at the start there, the variety of countries that are involved does present an opportunity to leverage some of these partnerships. And African countries do have a choice at the moment, and there are a number of countries who are going to the continent with sums of money to try and unlock some of these things. At the flip side, there are plenty of countries, and the UK being one of them, where mineral agreements are being signed as part of a whole plethora of agreements. So when Cyril Ramaphosa came to London for a state visit, I think that there were 18 agreements that were signed, including one around minerals. And so where you have multiple partnerships on different issues being signed, sometimes that's where you start to see some of these partnerships not receiving the attention, because they are one of many, many things that make up those bilateral relationships. And that's a point that brings us on to Dr. Veda Vanjanathan, as I said, Associate Fellow of the Foreign Policy and Security Studies at the Center for Social and Economic Progress in New Delhi, to talk really about the bilateral relationships between India and different African countries. And where does the African continent sit and feature in India's list of priority partners? And what are the key drivers behind India's strategic partnerships in Africa? How pivotal does India view the India-Africa partnership? And what do you think the comparative advantages are for partnerships between India and Africa? So, Veda, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, and we look forward to hearing your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. So I have an hour to go through all the questions, right? Joking.
Yes, either an hour or 15 minutes.
Okay. No, but first of all, I want to thank APRI for having me on this panel. It's fantastic to be here. It's also great timing for me because I've spent the last year working on a paper that looks at India, how India can build strategic partnerships with countries in Africa. And this has meant talking to different ministries in India, talking to the private sector, doing fieldwork in the continent, and talking to our fellow researchers in the continent. And all the more reason I wish I had this tool when I began last year. It would have saved me a lot of time. So first, congratulations to the team. It's a fantastic tool. It's a wealth of information. And I think, like the panelists before me pointed out, just the effort of putting all of this together in one place, tracking down these agreements. I mean, just the initial, just taking a look at it just gives you a sense of many different ways you can build on this data set. So congratulations on this. Before I jump into the Africa question, though, let me just quickly give you a glimpse of the critical mineral ecosystem in India, because when we're talking about the bilateral relationship, I think it's also important to just sort of make the point that the critical mineral ecosystem in India is also incredibly dynamic. A few things have already been mentioned in the report, so I'm not going to go into depth. But a joint venture between different companies in the Ministry of Mines called Kabil was set up in 2019, purely with the intention of going abroad and acquiring overseas assets. In 2023, the Ministry of Mines came out and identified 30 critical minerals for the country. It was the first time it did it. In the same year, the Minerals and Mines Act of 1957 was amended to sort of increase exploration in the country. And then last year at the union budget, the finance minister announced the National Critical Mineral Mission. And the timing is fantastic. Today, Jan 29th, the Union Cabinet just approved the mission, and they've allotted 16,300 crores for the mission, and it has a huge mandate. So it's an exciting time to be studying the space in India. A lot of the conversation within the country has been about what do we do with the resources within the country, because there are deposits of lithium and so on. But the fact remains that we are incredibly import dependent for a lot of minerals, right? And even looking at our interests abroad, for instance, Kabil has bought 5 blocks of lithium in Argentina. So a lot of the focus has been on Latin America, has been on Australia, countries like Bolivia, Chile, and so on. So the conversation on Africa or countries in Africa as potential partners is pretty nascent in the critical mineral sphere. But I also have to qualify this by saying that India has this huge, old, traditional, political, historic partnerships with countries in Africa. And it already has a lot of existing energy partnerships, hydrocarbon partnerships. If I'm not mistaken, 15% of India's hydrocarbons come from the continent. So there are a lot of private sector actors, there are a lot of public sector undertakings already active in the energy sphere. But within the critical minerals space, Africa is a nascent sort of entrant, which is also why it's been really exciting to do the study in the last year, because the way we approached the study was to say, okay, from all of the interviews we did, from the fieldwork we did in Zimbabwe and South Africa, from our conversations with researchers on the continent who are working on this, we try to map out what are diverse African priorities, breaking them down, and then sort of seeing what Indian interests are and where our strengths can be leveraged. Because like Chris mentioned, we are coming at this pretty late. We're also coming at this with far less resources. So the idea is, how can we sort of be a little bit more nimble in the way we enact policies? So one of the things that you can actually see if you use this tool is when you look at the bilateral agreements and you pick India, you see one of the tags that sort of appears in most of the mineral MOUs that exist is capacity building. Right? It's almost there in every single agreement. And this is foundational to the India-Africa bilateral relationship, even outside of the purview of critical minerals, because I think in 1949 was the first time, soon after India was independent, there was a capacity building MOU that was signed. So you have programs like the Indian Technical and Economic Cooperation that has trained 40,000 African scholars in the last 10 years, for instance. Another big part of it is also the development partnership. I think there have been over 200 projects that have been completed in over 40 countries. And concessional loans of $12 billion have been given out. So development projects exist, capacity building projects exist, frameworks exist. Now the question is, how do we sort of rethink these in the critical mineral sphere, right? If these frameworks already exist, when, for instance, a producer government in Africa is saying capacity building is a priority, and we already have these frameworks, one of the things that we're recommending is to sort of then use the existing MOUs and existing frameworks, existing tie-ups with universities, and sort of assist in this aspiration to build a critical mineral workforce. Another big shift that we're seeing, and I think this is also going to transcend into how India sees its critical mineral relationships with the continent, is that there is a very slow but deliberate shift in the way that India is engaging with the continent. For the longest time, it was led by capacity building, it was led by development partnerships, it was led by all of this. But we're seeing that sort of completely change by letting commercial actors, private sector actors take the lead. Right. And this, again, I think is going to be fundamental to how India engages the continent in the next 2 decades, because there are 2 reasons. One, because there is an interest, given the geography, how close the continent is, the fact that we have a huge diaspora, 3 million strong diaspora, which means that there are these commercial networks that exist. There is granular market intelligence that these private Indian actors have access to. So building these commercial relationships seem to be a priority for these actors. But now the question is, where do you raise funding from? And so one part of it is you see the government actually aligning a little bit with corporate India, which wasn't happening before, to sort of see, let's see which are the areas where we can sort of fuse or find some harmony between interests, national interests, and strategic commercial interests. This kind of symphony didn't actually happen before. That's an exciting thing to watch out for. Another really exciting thing that we've seen, I think, are going to be a very important component of India-Africa relations in the critical mineral sphere is these private sector startups. You have these technical startups in Bangalore, in Calcutta, that are coming up with very innovative mining technologies at scale. And you see them incorporate this and deploy this in different parts of India. And these companies are now going global. Some of them are going to map geological mapping in places like Indonesia. And you then sort of see, how can these actors who are low cost, scalable, quick, how can they be made part of the India's economic toolkit when it goes into these geographies, like this map shows us, which are hugely geopolitically competitive. And the political, I just want to emphasize the political or the geopolitical intent also sort of comes across in Africa, because now there's been a push to increase India's diplomatic presence. I think we've opened 16 to 18 new embassies in the continent, bringing the total number to 46. So it's not just that there's commercial interest, commercial actors wanting to go in. You also have then the political actors sort of stepping up engagement like they haven't done in a long while. But when it comes to Africa, the big question that we get is, which part of Africa do we go to? Where do we look at? So one of the things that we recommend in the paper also is the Southern African region, the SADC region. Again, this map tells us why. I don't have to explain why. But there are some challenges, and I should point this out. Processing is a big conversation in India. We do not have the capacity for it. So even if you do get all of these minerals, what do you do with it? Big problem. And that's kind of where I think these bilateral, multilateral frameworks that India is part of sort of kicks in, a way to sort of leverage strengths with other actors and sort of pool resources. Another point is also about financing, right? Like Chris mentioned, you're going into places where they have huge, much deeper pockets. But again, we see actors being a little creative. Recently, an Indian consortium signed a deal with the UAE's international holdings, international resources holdings, and you sort of see them thinking creatively in terms of accessing other forms of finance beyond just the Indian government's resources. So these are just few things I want to throw out there for Q&A, but overall, a very exciting space to be studying. And hopefully our paper will be launched soon so we can have a more in-depth conversation. Thank you.
Veda, thank you very much. Some really useful reflections there on how minerals partnerships sit within a wider range of government interventions and approaches, particularly around technological cooperation, deepening development partnerships, skills and capacity building programs, including university partnerships. And I think from elsewhere, we've seen partnerships between geological surveys, chambers of mines, and schools of mines. Really interesting to hear the upgrading and upscaling of diplomatic presence on the continent, but how that can marry with a private sector led approach, including, as you noted, the development of innovative technologies in India that can be upscaled and can be applied in an African context. And there are plenty of, already a number of African mining companies with a presence on the continent, including Jindal Group, Vedanta. There is a established Indian mining private sector presence, particularly across Southern Africa. So thank you very much for that that intervention. This is excellent. This now gives us a good 20 minutes for Q&A before we have some final comments. And so we've got plenty of comments coming through, and so I think that perhaps Judy, I believe you've been watching the comments coming through, and perhaps you're able to present a cluster of questions on a similar theme, and we'll let the speakers answer that first cluster, and then we'll come around again for another cluster of questions. So, Judy, what have we seen come through the chat?
Hi, Chris. I've posted some questions in our chat here. We received 7 in total. Some of them are some questions for clarification, but maybe let's start with question 3. This can be they're not directed to a specific speaker. So the question is, can you expand further on how developed countries have used industrial policy to add value in their countries at the expense of African countries? And then maybe just linked to that, there's a question that says, Africa has always been a source of raw materials for value addition in advanced economies. Why would advanced economies want to do anything different now? So maybe just those two aspects.
Perfect. I might ask William to take on those if he can. William.
Thanks very much, Chris. Yeah, so on the first question about how advanced economies have used industrial policy to add value to minerals in their territories, potentially at the expense of African countries and others. Yeah, we see a kind of a range of different policies being pursued. I think some of them, some of the policies wouldn't necessarily be at the expense of the rest of the world. Particularly, efforts to boost productivity through regulatory reform, infrastructure, and research funding. But I think that where we might have more concerns of where the policies being pursued would be distortive, and would both shrink the pie and distort it in favor of those economies. And so these are things like the use of grants, subsidies, local content requirements for tax breaks, where a certain amount of the value has to have been sourced either within the country in question or within certain kind of from certain favoured foreign countries. Yeah, I think these are some of the examples of the policies that are being pursued. And then the second question was on why advanced economies would want to do anything different now, and to accept importing value-added resources rather than raw materials from Africa. And I think this is this could really depend on what African countries themselves do, and how well they can leverage their position of suppliers of resources that the world wants. And I think the very fact that all of these agreements all of these MOUs are being signed shows the kind of the level of importance inside the world's governments to securing supplies of these minerals, and that's something that African countries can use to kind of win concessions. And I think that we've potentially seen it with Zambia's economic diplomacy that I mentioned in the presentation. Also, Chile's SQM saying, look, if you want discounted access to our lithium, you're going to have to invest in downstream processing. But I think another point is that for many countries, actually they don't want to have many advanced economies that import these minerals. They maybe don't want to have the entire value chain in their own backyards. Those governments can't do everything either, and those economies will not be able to develop every segment. And so there's kind of there's also a potential there for sort of win-win partnerships where, in essence, the downstream countries accept to develop the first rungs of the value addition process within Africa in return for access to the minerals. Now, of course, African countries may not want to stop there. They may want to go further. But I'd argue that there's still kind of benefits of taking that first step, and then countries can kind of build on pursuing the development of value chain segments that are further along the value chain. But at the same time, it's also important to say that it's not always going to be the priority. Both in terms of supporting Africa's economic growth and industrialization, but also in terms of broader public policy priorities. Yes, developing mineral value chains and increased value addition can bring economic benefits, but there are other opportunities for Africa's industrial development too. Governments can't do everything because of limited bureaucratic and financial capacity. And so you've really got to kind of make a choice about what which of those opportunities offers the best prospects for the country in question, and how many can be pursued at the same time. Thanks very much.
William, thank you very much. And there's some questions here that Judy sent through, and I want to pick up on something there and pass it over to Jim. And it's a question. There's also something that William touched upon, which is this idea of investment attraction and a race to the bottom when it comes to a perceived race to the bottom when it comes to legislation and regulation. And this is something that there's been a lot of discussion about, particularly in discussions around resource nationalism, of having very regulation in place that is trying to be more open than anybody else to try and attract investment in. And then once the fixed capital goes in, then there's changes. So I want to ask you about that. Is there really a race to the bottom? And I want to be perhaps a little bit unfair to you, Jim, in that you have many years ago now published a paper about institutions and the strength of institutions being part of a reason for oil and gas investment. And I want to ask you, on the point around the race to the bottom, do you think it's the point that you were making in that paper many years ago, that investment flows to countries where they have stronger and more robust institutional environments? Do you think that that's the case in the mining sector? Do you think that actually, it's a false narrative of governments to think, we need to be, as open and loose as possible? Is it more about if we can be as robust as possible and demonstrate consistency, that's what's going to, an institutional strength will attract investment? So please, Jim, and sorry if I'm being a little bit unfair.
No, not at all. I mean, these are great questions. So yeah, I mean, I think the same kind of insight applies to the mining sector, right? So if you look at things like the Fraser Institute survey, which asks mining company CEOs and investors what they care about, they consistently put things like the stability of the government and the stability of the investment environment far higher than the individual fiscal terms that they're being offered. And so this is a big misconception that often happens, which is that governments think it's about offering a sweeter deal, whether it's a tax holiday or whether it's some preferential access or reduced royalty rates or whatever it might be. But as you say, Chris, there's much bigger things at play, which is what the investors are really looking at. And I think the same will apply here when we're looking beyond just the mine itself to downstream value addition, because global value chains are very demanding. And for African countries to really break into these value chains, then they're going to need the stability of the political environment, the investment environment, the stability and reliability of the electricity, of the ports, of the transportation infrastructure, of all of these other kinds of enablers, before we even start talking about the tax rate and other kinds of fiscal concessions. So, the opportunity from these kinds of agreements is that they can really help governments get their act together in terms of this enabling environment to create a space that is conducive for breaking into global value chains. So that's the opportunity. But the reality check here, like Will was mentioning, is that the question is where the kind of processing capacity is going to be. And part of the reason why there is renewed interest, frankly, in Africa is because a huge amount of this processing is happening in China for many of these minerals. But the reality check for some African countries is to remember that many of these counterpart countries are not doing the processing themselves, right? So take an example like Australia has a huge amount of iron ore coming out of Western Australia. Where is all the smelting blast furnace capacity? It's in China. Are the Australians panicking about that and putting up protectionist barriers or engaging in aggressive industrial policy to correct that? Not really. No, they do other things. They have a very diversified economy. And so it's not necessarily the case that just because you have a lot of iron ore in the ground, you need to have a lot of smelting capacity. It's also not also the case that just because you have a lot of iron ore in the ground, you're going to have a comparative advantage in doing a lot of the downstream processing. And so these things need to be taken into account, because when we start talking about the sort of fiscal concessions and the potential for race to the bottom, this really comes into play. Because if a country becomes dead set on saying, okay, because we have copper, we therefore need to become an EV manufacturing hub or a battery manufacturing hub, or the same with lithium, then you might find yourself in some very difficult negotiations of offering quite a lot of concessions in order to secure that kind of investment. And that may not be in the best interest of the country long term. It may not be the strategic opportunity for the country. If you just take something like DRC Zambia, where there's a lot of ambition in this direction, and maybe this is the right strategy. I'm not saying it isn't, but there's also more proximate opportunities. So rather than having the ambition of a gigafactory building EVs, in Kinshasa or in Zambia somewhere, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in terms of using the copper to make higher voltage power cables. There's already low voltage power cables being manufactured in the region. It wouldn't be a huge leap to then get to this higher capability of producing these high value, high voltage power cables that then could serve regional electricity infrastructure demand. And you can do that without, giving away the farm, without making these kinds of, very challenging concessions that some of these countries might have to make. And to come back to your original point, Chris, the insight from some of this research about the importance of institutions is that if you don't have the strength of public institutions and the stable investment environment and so on, you end up having to give away a lot in terms of the rents on your resources to sort of compensate investors for that additional risk. So it'd be a lot cheaper to actually strengthen the institutions and provide the stability in the investment environment than to give away all of these rents to compensate for that risk. And I think the same principle applies in the downstream as well.
Brilliant, Jim. Thank you very much. And you got a thumbs up from Will there on that point. And on the yeah, there is an article about Zambia's economic diplomacy in the South African Journal of International Affairs, published last year, and also want to pick up on that. You know, the DRC Zambia point. There's, you know, there have been questions in the chat that maybe someone wants to pick up on partnerships between African countries, and you know, there is this MOU between DRC and Zambia. The respective governments are at a point of needing to form committees that can talk to each other, and the development of that agreement or the development of that MOU has taken place in the context where they closed the border last year over kind of protectionism around FMCG, you know, small manufactured goods, and then the border closed for copper. So, you know, there are still kind of these trade spats that prevent the deepening of these bigger partnerships. But I want to come to Veda next, and there's been a question that's specifically targeted to you, but I'm going to give you perhaps I want you to reflect on both, you know, some of the positives and some of the negatives, and particularly in light of this question of how do we move from zero sum to win-win. And one of the questions has said that one of India's largest companies, the Adani Group, was recently indicted by a US court and has faced criticism in Australia. Not expecting you to necessarily have deep knowledge around the indictment, but you know, where companies are behaving badly overseas, you know, how does that have a negative impact, and what does that mean about partnership development? But then perhaps on the more positive side, you know, what are the lessons that could come out of the Indian mining sector, particularly things like how to avoid the resource curse, or how to develop mining in a social context where for your social license to operate, you'll need to have more labor intensive versus capital intensive mining, for example. So Veda, over to you, please.
Fireworks. This isn't good news, right? I mean, there's no way around it. This isn't good news on any front. And I think as you see Indian companies go global, and this isn't the first time, Vedanta had issues in Zambia as well. So I think as you see Indian companies go global, you're going to probably see more of this. But the conversation back home is more about how do we sort of improve accountability, right? How do we create accountability mechanisms? How do we create these checks and balances? How do we build in sustainable and mining guardrails, right? How do we maintain strong regulatory scrutiny over these actors who are going beyond borders? And if there are instances of proven malpractice, then how can action be taken? So these are all questions that are sort of coming up out of this conversation. And these are questions I think that will take a little bit of time because, again, like I said, Indian actors in this fray this is new space. This is an entirely new ecosystem for them to be acting in. And hopefully with time, they'll also, we'll work these things out. But I also do want to say that this is a problem in itself about Indian corporations going global and operating in ecosystems where perhaps in the absence of guardrails, there are issues in their operations. But another problem is mining itself, right? Even within India, there's a lot of challenges when it comes to, issues of ESG around mining. And just to sort of give you a critical mineral perspective on this, I accompanied scholars from the Zimbabwe Environmental Law Association when they were doing some of their field work near Bulawayo, and we visited British mines and Chinese mines, and this is a mining story also. We all need to do better, right? We need to sort of understand that within this framing of geopolitical race to the bottom, our community is at the center of it, right? Where everybody is kind of failing them. So, and I think that information for me was crucial because then while we're writing recommendations for Indian actors here, it was sort of to say there are a lot of low-hanging fruit in terms of how we can do better. It's not even going to be capital intensive to do better, right? So I think that is a larger conversation about how these corporations, when they're entering this kind of an ecosystem, how do we not repeat the mistakes that we've made in the last 3 decades or 4 decades? And then, Chris, to your question of how has this panned out in India, I think one of the things that have It's problematic. I'm not gonna package it as something that's been really successful, but one of the formats that have been attempted and have partially been successful is something like the district mineral fund, right? Where they've institutionalized this at a district level. When there are big mining projects in a particular district, the district administration gets a percentage of those funds, and they're allocated for community purposes. So there are these models that exist, not entirely successful, but partially successful. So I think this would give us glimpses into how, when India develops its critical mineral strategies, to keep this in mind and sort of make this a concrete, I don't know how we would make it concrete, but at least intentionally make this an important part of the conversation.
Veda, thank you very much. We're very close to needing to hand back to the organisers now for their final vote of thanks and concluding remarks. But I think that what we'll do, we'll give the speakers another opportunity to respond to some of the questions that have been answered, and I'll kind of collate them. I think that there's some the issue around Africa to Africa partnerships. What are the speakers' views on that? The issues around partnerships being exploitative versus partnerships being genuine opportunities for African producers. What do the speakers feel like that? It feels like Veda has already created a new multinational research network entitled "We All Need to Do Better." But I want to hear what the speakers' comments are about. Where some of the issues that have been raised by some of the people in the Q&A and in the session there about, particularly on this need to do better. What do they think that the answers are based on the material in the report that we're discussing around Africa's green mineral partnerships? What are some of the key lessons from the report that speak to some of the issues that have been raised? So we'll go down the list of speakers again, and then we'll hand over to Amandine. So William, please, first.
Thanks very much, Chris. I want to talk about two things. The first is the role of Africa to Africa partnerships in making the most of the continent's green minerals. And the second is the question about whether these agreements are exploitative. So starting on Africa to Africa partnerships, I think that, I haven't seen a lot of Africa to Africa partnerships in this space. It perhaps reflects the fact that at the moment, I believe only 2% of the continent's critical mineral exports go to other African countries. I think one key area in which African countries can collaborate is trying to develop economies of scale in downstream industries, and I think that's that is something that the DRC Zambia initiative tries to do. I think it's a key part of that is sort of avoiding or making exceptions to the restrictions on the exports of raw minerals that several African countries are pursuing. In essence, if each country tries to process and add value locally, unless there's sufficient scale to achieve efficiency, that those downstream industries are not really going to be competitive. And in addition, in some cases, for some stages of the value chain, individual African countries don't possess all of the minerals that they need. And I think that the sort of African continental free trade area is often invoked as a framework that can guide this sort of cooperation. But aside from the fact that still needs to really come into effect, the other challenge is that there are very limited disciplines on export restrictions within the treaty, and so you would need something either additional to it or outside of it to address this issue of export restrictions. on the question of whether the agreements are exploitative, those that I've seen don't seem to be exploitative as much as ineffective. I think that was kind of a point that I made in my presentation, that most of these agreements don't really seem to do anything concrete, so in that sense they can't really be exploitative. I think the question of exploitation kind of ties into the sort of broader question of whether you think the supply of continuing the supply of raw materials is in itself exploitative, and I think that is a question that isn't going to be determined by these agreements themselves, but rather by the question of whether African countries are getting a good deal from mineral exploitation at the moment. And it's something where you need to look into tax regimes, and if it's considered that tax revenues alone aren't the sole priority, then kind of looking into using industrial policies to develop industries upstream and downstream of mining. Thanks very much.
William, thank you very much. Jim.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, just to build on what Will was saying, I think on the Africa to Africa, we need to see more of this kind of collaboration, whether it's agreements or not. I mean, the Continental Free Trade Agreement gives a framework for this kind of collaboration. The RECs give frameworks for this kind of collaboration as well, but we're not seeing enough of this. And if we're going to be very frank, for many countries, just getting the mineral out of the ground and to the market requires regional cooperation before we even start thinking about the challenge of breaking into value chains, and Will's point about achieving the kind of scale efficiency that's going to be necessary to really be globally competitive. And so this is a big challenge. Countries are going to need to step up if they really want to realize the ambition that they have. And like my original point about how local content legislation goes completely in the other direction to what the Continental Free Trade Agreement is trying to achieve, there's a risk here again with this kind of bilateral cooperation that countries sort of do it alone, try and do it alone, rather than doing it regionally and collaboratively. And it's going to be much harder doing it that way because of the scale challenges, the transportation links that cross borders, the energy links that cross borders, the geology that crosses borders, and so on. So just to say, I think this is a sort of a bit of a wake-up call to say there's going to need to be more regional collaboration than I think we're seeing.
Excellent, thank you very much. And Veda.
Just to add to, I mean, just to sort of reiterate what both of them have said, I think it comes down to, simply put, it comes down to questions of infrastructure. It comes down to questions of negotiation. We've heard this over and over again about how negotiating these deals are not just capital intensive, resource intensive, but they take, you need to take a long durée perspective on it, the challenges that come with it. And just to sort of club the earlier question as well, right? Why would advanced economies want to do anything different now? I just think it all boils down this question of Africa to Africa trade, and that boils down to this question of African agency. We've seen instances, even when you're looking at resource diplomacy and hydrocarbons, when the state has stepped in or when the African agency has kicked in. Paul Nanterlier has written about this. Folashade Soule has written about this. There have been changes in the way that the consumer has dealt with these countries. So I think my final argument would be that it all sort of, the power really rests with the African agency.
Brilliant. Well, it leaves me only with the job of saying thank you very much to each of our speakers for your comments and for your analysis. It's been really, really useful and a really robust conversation. And so I'd like to now hand back to Amandine and just say, well, firstly, Amandine, congratulations on producing this piece of work. The report and the mapping and the online interactive tools are really useful. And like I say, one of the first holistic pieces of work covering all of this with lots of applicability and usefulness for all of us here, for all of our different research needs. So thank you very much. And over to you for your final comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Now my turn to thank you. It was a really great moderation. Thank you so much. Thank you to the speakers. Just one last word, just to say that this is just the beginning. I mean, we really open both the discussion, but also we are really looking forward to receiving your comments, your feedback. And what I'm saying, this is just the beginning. It's also because obviously I saw one of the comments was also how maybe should we include the private sectors, the companies? So this is also something we have in mind. We need to explore this. There is not only public actors, but as you know, there is also private actors. So we would like to, we wanted to also integrate these actors. And I think one of the key points which was mentioned today is also the gap between the fact that we have this agreement signed, but what about the implementation? So this is also something we would like now to think about and to make sure that we have concrete factors. We can better understand why these agreements are not implemented and why. And I would say the last thing is that also that we would like also to develop this African agency perspective. I think that, as Veda said, it has been analyzed through more, let's say, diplomatic perspective. But what about the mining perspective, the critical minerals perspective, when we talk about African agency, and also to make the link with what Jim said, that we have the framework with the MDC, with the African Union, with the REX. So we want to explore also these aspects. I will stop there, and I would say once again, thank you very much for everything, the speakers, Chris for the moderation, the team for supporting the organization of the webinar, and thank you for everything. And so let's keep in touch, and then thank you so much. Bye bye.